The silence in a place like this isn't empty. It has a weight, a texture like damp wool. It's a rhythmic, mechanical silence composed of the hum of the HVAC system and the distant, metallic clatter of a meal cart 3 corridors away. I sat on the edge of my cot, my hands resting flat on my thighs, staring at the painted cinder block wall. It was the exact shade of a faded filing cabinet, a color designed to disappear. That was the moment I realized no one was coming to help. It wasn't a realization that arrived with a crash or a cinematic swell of music. It was just a cold, logical conclusion, like a line of code that finally compiled after 1,000 errors. The world outside had accepted the story Dalia had written for me. They liked the narrative. It was clean, it was dramatic, and it cast her as the resilient martyr. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. In my previous life, as a warehouse systems manager, I dealt in absolute truths. A barcode either scans or it doesn't. An automated picker is either at its station or it is malfunctioning. There is no room for interpretation in a logistics manifest. Dalia, however, dealt in the fluid, the aesthetic, and the persuasive. She understood that if you repeat a lie with enough conviction and wrap it in the right branding, the truth becomes an annoying technicality that people are happy to ignore. She had painted me as the architect of her sister's ruin, the hidden hand that pulled the plug on a family's stability. She did it with a surgeon's precision, using fabricated email trails and coach statements that looked indistinguishable from the real thing to a casual observer. The facility administrator, a man named Miller, whose skin always looked slightly gray under the fluorescent lights, knocked on the reinforced glass of my door. He didn't wait for me to look up. He never did. He just slid a laminated sheet through the slot. "Visitor request," Miller said, his voice flat. "Monthly. Same person." "Refused," I said. My voice was raspy from disuse, but steady. "You haven't seen her in 22 months, Solen. It looks bad on the reports. The board likes to see rehabilitative engagement." "I'm not here to satisfy the board's aesthetic preferences, Miller. Send her away." I knew what Dalia wanted. She wanted the visual of the visit. She wanted to sit across from me, perhaps wearing something understated but expensive, and look at me with those practiced, empathetic eyes. She wanted to maintain the connection so she could keep the pulse of my resentment, ensuring it stayed buried under the weight of her influence. By refusing her, I was denying her the final chapter of her performance. It was the only lever I had left, and I pulled it every 30 days with mechanical regularity. When Miller shuffled away, I turned my attention back to the stack of legal documents on my small desk. These were the records of the proceedings, the digital evidence that had put me here. For a long time, I couldn't look at them without a spike of heat in my chest, a physical reaction I had to learn to suppress. Now, I looked at them the way I used to look at a corrupted inventory database. I wasn't looking for justice anymore. I was looking for the glitch. Dalia was smart, but she was a creative, not a systems architect. She understood how to make things look real, but she didn't understand how data actually lives and breathes. She had printed out emails, screenshots of chats, and logs of financial transfers. To the legal clerk and the investigators, they were a paper trail. To me, they were a series of outputs. And every output has a source. I spent hours cross-referencing the timestamps she had provided in her testimony. I had requested the raw metadata from my own devices, a request that had been granted mostly because the prosecution thought I was grasping at straws. They saw a man trying to find a loophole. I saw a man looking for a misplaced decimal point. The sarcasm of my situation wasn't lost on me. I was a man who optimized flow for a living, now trapped in a place where time was the only thing that didn't move. I thought about Dalia's online lifestyle business, Harson Home. It was all soft lighting, linen textures, and authentic living. She had used her contacts in that world to spread the narrative of my instability long before the first legal filing was even made. She had primed the audience. By the time the accusations landed, the public, and more importantly the witnesses, had already been conditioned to believe the worst of me. I began to notice the inconsistencies on page 42 of the digital forensic report. It was a minor detail, something most people would overlook. A login attempt from my primary workstation at 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. The prosecution used it to show I was hiding assets in the middle of the night, but I remembered that Tuesday. The warehouse had a massive sorting failure in Sector 7. I was on the floor for 18 hours straight, visible on 40 different security cameras, nowhere near a computer terminal. If I wasn't at the computer, who was? Dalia had claimed she was at a retreat in Ojai that weekend. She had posted photos, sunsets, yoga mats, green juice, but as I looked at the metadata of the login, I saw the IP address. It wasn't a masked VPN. It was a local residential hub, specifically the hub assigned to our guest house, the place she used as her home office. I leaned back, the plastic chair creaking under my weight. My heart didn't race. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I felt a profound, settling calm. It was the feeling of a machine finally clicking into gear after being jammed for years. She had been careless, not because she was unintelligent, but because she was arrogant. She believed her narrative was so powerful that the underlying data wouldn't matter. She thought the story was the reality. The legal clerk, a young man named Eris, who looked like he was perpetually apologizing for his own existence, came by later that afternoon to collect my signed refusal forms. He looked at the stacks of paper on my desk, the handwritten timelines I had taped to the wall, and the meticulous notes I had scrawled in the margins of the transcripts. "You're still at it, huh?" Eris asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Most guys just watch the television in the common room. You're the only one I know who asks for more paperwork." "The television is full of stories, Eris," I said, not looking up. "I've had enough stories to last me a lifetime. I prefer the logs. Logs don't have an agenda." "You know, your wife, she calls the office sometimes to check on your progress. She sounds genuinely concerned. It's a lot more than most people get." I finally looked at him. I gave him a small, dry smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "She is concerned, Eris. She's very concerned with the progress of the narrative. She wants to make sure the ending stays exactly where she wrote it." Eris shifted uncomfortably. He didn't get it. To him, Dalia was the tragic figure on the news, the woman who had lost everything but her dignity. He couldn't see the woman who had sat at a desk at 3:14 a.m., carefully typing out the messages that would ruin her own sister and pave the way for my removal. "Anyway," Eris said, clearing his throat, your records request for the third-party server logs came through. It's a mess. Thousands of pages of raw data. No one's even bothered to sort it. You still want it?" "Yes," I said. "Every page." "It'll take a week to process the printouts. Just thought you'd want to know." "I have time," I replied. After he left, I went back to my timeline. I had started to map out the overlap between Dalia's business account fluctuations and the dates of the alleged thefts I had committed. The symmetry was beautiful in its ugliness. Every time her brand needed a capital injection, a new piece of evidence would surface against me, allowing her to claim insurance or restructure her sister's remaining assets under her own name. She wasn't just framing me, she was using me as a human shield for her own failing empire. I spent the evening in a state of quiet, focused intensity. I didn't think about the 2 years I had lost. I didn't think about the people who had turned their backs on me or the career that was currently a pile of ash. Those were emotional variables, and they didn't help the calculation. Instead, I thought about the metadata. I thought about the digital fingerprints she had left behind like greasy smudges on a clean window. She had built a house of cards and spent 2 years convincing the world it was a fortress. She was out there now, probably planning her next rebranding, unaware that the man she thought she had buried was quietly taking inventory of every single lie. I looked at the final page of the forensic summary. There was a confirmation code for a file that hadn't been included in the initial discovery phase, a file that had been flagged as system background and ignored by the prosecution. It was a log of the administrative access to the very software I had designed for the warehouse. My hand stayed steady as I circled the entry. No one expected me to look for it because no one believed I was innocent. They thought I was a man defeated by his own greed. They didn't realize that a systems manager doesn't just build a process. He knows how to find where the process was breached. I lay down on the cot as the lights began to dim for the nightly lockdown. The shadows stretched across the floor, turning the gray walls into deep, bottomless pits. For the first time in 22 months, I didn't feel like a prisoner. I felt like a technician waiting for the system to reboot. Dalia thought she had won because I was behind a locked door. She didn't realize that from in here, I had a perfect view of the cracks in her foundation. The truth wasn't something that would set me free. It was a tool I was going to use to dismantle her piece by piece. I closed my eyes, the mechanical silence of the facility finally feeling like an ally. The first move had been made. She didn't know it yet, but the data was already beginning to turn against her. The second year of my confinement brought a change in the atmosphere of my cell. It no longer felt like a box. It felt like a laboratory. The stack of raw data Eris had promised arrived in 3 heavy cardboard crates. The guards looked at the boxes with a mixture of boredom and pity, seeing only a mountain of useless paper. To them, I was a man drowning in his own obsession. They didn't understand that for a systems manager, a mountain of data isn't a burden. It's a map. I began the process of indexing. Without a computer, I had to rely on the manual methods of a previous century. I used colored pencils, a ruler, and a series of notebooks I purchased through the commissary. I was looking for the digital fingerprints, the tiny indelible marks that every user leaves behind when they interact with a network. Dalia had been meticulous in her public presentation, but her understanding of digital forensics was purely superficial. She knew how to delete an email, but she didn't know how to scrub the server headers or the packet logs that recorded the origin of the transmission. I spent 16 hours a day translating hex codes and IP addresses into a physical timeline on my wall. I was learning the language of her betrayal, a dialect composed of timestamps and routing jumps. It was a tedious, grueling process, but it provided a clarity that my previous life had lacked. In the warehouse, I had managed thousands of moving parts simultaneously. Here, I only had to manage one, the sequence of Dalia's lies. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that Dalia hadn't just framed me, she had authored a complete alternate reality. She had used a spoofing application to mirror my phone's MAC address, making it appear as though I were sending messages from devices I hadn't touched in months. It was a clever trick, one that would fool a standard police investigation, but it left a trail of inconsistencies in the handoff between cell towers. I began logging these discrepancies by hand, creating a spreadsheet of her movements versus my supposed activity. The data showed that while I was supposedly liquidating assets from a laptop in our home, the laptop was actually communicating with a localized hub that Dalia was using at her wellness retreat. I stopped thinking about the concept of freedom as an abstract emotional state. Freedom, in my new calculation, was merely the final stage of a successful implementation plan. I didn't want to be released because of a legal error or a compassionate plea. I wanted to walk out only when the timing was optimal for the maximum disruption of Dalia's interests. I began to monitor her brand through the limited business periodicals available in the facility library. Harson Home was expanding. She was pivoting into luxury textiles and automated home logistics, ironically, the very field I had spent my career mastering. She was using the capital she had harvested from her sister's collapse to build a warehouse infrastructure of her own. She was even using some of the proprietary sorting algorithms I had developed. It was a bold move, a signature of her arrogance. She thought she had inherited my intellect along with my assets. One Tuesday afternoon, while I was cross-referencing a series of internal server pings against Dalia's public social media posts, I found the file that should not have existed. It was an automated backup log from a third-party cloud provider we had used briefly 5 years ago for a joint venture. The prosecution had missed it because the account was listed under a defunct corporate entity, but Dalia had used it. She had used that dormant account as a staging area for the fabricated documents. She likely thought the account was unmonitored and deleted, but the provider's retention policy had kept a ghost copy of the activity logs. I sat back, my pencil hovering over the page. The logs showed a series of document uploads and last modified dates that occurred weeks before the events they were supposed to document. She had drafted the incriminating emails before the supposed conflict had even started. She had written the script before she cast me in the role. It was the smoking gun, hidden in a mountain of digital refuse. The metadata was undeniable. It showed the creation path, the author identity, linked to her private hardware, and the deliberate manipulation of the system clock. The realization brought a surge of cold, focused energy. I wasn't just a victim of a lie, I was the observer of a technical failure. Dalia had left a backdoor open, and I was the only one with the key. I began to file formal records requests for the specific server packets tied to that account. I did it quietly, through the facility's legal kiosk, couched in the language of a pro se civil appeal regarding my own estate. I didn't want to alert her. I wanted the evidence to be gathered and certified by the court clerks before she even knew I was looking in that direction. I noticed Miller watching me through the glass more frequently. He didn't like the way I looked anymore. I wasn't the slumped, defeated man who had arrived 2 years ago. I was upright, my movements precise and deliberate. I had stopped attending the communal television sessions entirely. I had stopped eating the processed junk from the commissary, sticking to a strict, functional diet. I was conditioning myself, both mentally and physically, for the transition from the defensive to the offensive. "You're getting a lot of mail from the district clerk's office," Miller said during a routine cell inspection. He flicked through the stack of certified envelopes on my desk. "Most guys in here are trying to get their sentences reduced. You look like you're trying to audit the entire state." "I'm just interested in the integrity of the record, Miller," I said, my voice dry and devoid of emotion. "Errors in the system lead to inefficiencies. I've always been a man who hates waste." "Well, you're wasting a lot of ink," he grunted, but he didn't confiscate the papers. There was nothing illegal about a man reviewing his own case files. By the end of the month, I had enough. I had a documented trail that proved Dalia had authored the accusations from her own devices, using her own business accounts to fund the staging of the evidence. The overlap was total. Every time her brand faced a quarterly deficit, a new piece of damning information against me would appear, allowing her to draw on the trust funds she had seized. She wasn't just a liar. She was a poorly optimized algorithm, repeating the same pattern over and over because it had worked once. The rehook came when I received a response from a secondary records request I'd made regarding Dalia's sister, Clara. The prosecution had claimed I had drained Clara's accounts through a series of unauthorized transfers, but the granular logs from the payment processor showed that the transfers weren't initiated by me. They were initiated by an administrative user with super user privileges on the Harson Home corporate network, a network I had been locked out of months before the transfers occurred. Dalia hadn't just framed me for her own actions. She had used my own security protocols to hide her tracks. I began to realize that Dalia's business wasn't just a lifestyle brand. It was a laundering operation for the assets she was stripping from her family, and she was about to take it public. I read a small snippet in a trade magazine about Harson Home's upcoming initial offering and a massive new distribution center they were opening in the valley. The timing was perfect. She was at the peak of her perceived success, her narrative fully integrated into the public consciousness. She was vulnerable in the way only a person who thinks they are untouchable can be. I stopped thinking about the truth as something that would save me. The truth was just another resource to be deployed. I didn't want a retrial. A retrial was slow, messy, and dependent on the whims of a jury that had already been poisoned by her charm. I wanted something more surgical. I wanted to trigger a systematic collapse of her reputation and her infrastructure simultaneously. I drafted a letter to a digital forensics expert I had worked with years ago, a man named Elias, who didn't care about narratives, only about the purity of the data. I didn't ask him for help. I sent him a single page of the hex codes I had uncovered and a set of coordinates for the cloud backup. I knew Elias. He wouldn't be able to resist a puzzle of this complexity. He would look into it out of professional curiosity, and once he saw what I had seen, he would know exactly what to do with the information. As I sat in the darkness of my cell that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the facility, I felt a profound sense of shift. The walls were still there, the bars were still there, and the gray uniform was still on my back. But the power dynamic had inverted. Dalia was out there, living in a house built on a foundation of corrupted data, while I was in here, holding the only clean copy of the record. I began to plan my exit, not just the date of my release, but the sequence of events that would follow. I needed to coordinate the legal filings with the public reveal of her business's technical failures. I needed to ensure that when I walked out, I wasn't just a man who had been exonerated. I was a man who was ready to reclaim the territory she had stolen. The cliffhanger came when Eris arrived the following morning, looking more agitated than usual. He didn't have any paperwork for me. He looked around the cell, his eyes landing on the elaborate maps of data on my walls. "Solen," he whispered, glancing back at the guard station. "I don't know what you're digging for, but someone's noticed. There was a query from a private legal firm this morning, not your lawyer's, but hers. They're asking for a full audit of every records request you've made in the last 6 months." I didn't blink. I didn't feel a tremor of fear. "Let them audit, Eris. It's all public record." "You don't understand," Eris said, leaning in. "They aren't just looking at the requests. They're looking at the server logs you requested, specifically the ones involving the Harson Home business accounts. Dalia just filed an emergency motion to seal those records, claiming they contain proprietary trade secrets." I smiled, a genuine cold smile. "She's late, Oris. The records have already been certified, and she just confirmed exactly what I was looking for." The momentum of a silent machine is a terrifying thing once it finds its rhythm. By the time the 3rd year of my confinement began to bleed into the 4th, I had moved beyond mere observation. I was now an architect of a different sort, drafting the blueprints for a structural failure that Dalia would never see coming because she was too busy looking at her own reflection in the glowing screen of her success. I had established a secure, albeit slow, line of communication with Elias. He was a man who lived in the spaces between networks, a forensic specialist who treated data with a reverence others reserved for ancient relics. My letters to him were coded, couched in the mundane language of warehouse logistics and inventory management, terms that would pass any casual inspection by the facility sensors but whispered a different story to a trained ear. Elias had confirmed my findings within weeks. The hex codes I had sent were the breadcrumbs of a digital haunting. He had located the ghost copies of the staging documents and, more importantly, he had traced the origin of the super user logins to a specific hardware signature. It wasn't just a residential hub, it was a high-end mobile device registered to Dalia's personal account. The fingerprints were all over the crime she had pinned on me. Every fabricated email, every diverted fund, every piece of evidence had been birthed from a device she kept in her handbag. "I've mapped the flow," Elias wrote back in a letter disguised as a discussion about palette optimization software. The contradictions are absolute. The system says the user was in one location, but the network handshakes prove they were in another. It's a total misalignment of the record. What do you want to do with the logs? I didn't answer him immediately. I wasn't interested in a quick exoneration. If I simply proved my innocence now, Dalia would have time to pivot, to liquidate her remaining assets and disappear into a new identity with a fresh set of lies. I needed her to be fully invested. I needed her to be at the exact moment of her greatest public triumph, where the height of her fall would ensure the total destruction of the brand she had built on my back. I instructed Elias to wait. I told him to hold the data, to certify it with a neutral third party, and to keep his finger on the pulse of Harsenholm's upcoming product launch. Dalia, meanwhile, was escalating her public narrative. The facility library received a copy of a high-end lifestyle magazine featuring her on the cover. She looked radiant, seated in a minimalist office, the caption reading, "Rising from the Ashes." How Dalia Harsen rebuilt a legacy after betrayal. In the interview, she spoke about closure and the burden of carrying a secret for so long. She was subtly reinforcing the idea that I was not just a thief, but a psychological weight she had finally shed. I read the article with a dry, detached amusement. She was performing for an audience of millions, unaware that the stage was being dismantled beneath her feet. I began to exert my influence from within the walls. It was subtle at first, a series of anonymous tips sent to the payment processors and logistics partners Dalia was courting for her expansion. I didn't send accusations. I sent questions. I sent inquiries regarding metadata discrepancies in the historical audits of Harsenholm. I knew how these corporate entities operated. They didn't care about morality, but they were terrified of liability. If there was even a hint that their new partner's financial history was built on corrupted data, their automated risk assessment protocols would trigger a manual review. The first action scene of my campaign didn't involve a physical confrontation. It was a live product launch for Dalia's new line of smart home organizers. She was hosting a streaming event from a flagship warehouse, a high-tech facility that was supposed to represent the future of her brand. I had studied the technical specifications of the warehouse's automated systems that were eerily similar to the ones I had designed years ago. I knew the vulnerabilities of the firmware. I knew the specific sequence of commands that would cause a soft failure in the sorting matrix. I didn't hack the system. I didn't need to. I simply used the information I had gathered to identify a pre-existing conflict in her inventory software, a conflict she had ignored in her rush to scale. Through a series of legal inquiries made by Elias's associates, we requested a compliance check on the software's licensing. The request triggered an automated system freeze during the live demonstration. On the small flickering television in the common room, I watched the disaster unfold. Dalia stood on a pristine stage, gesturing toward a row of automated pickers that were supposed to gracefully assemble a gift box. Instead, the machines stalled. The red status lights began to blink in a frantic, rhythmic pattern. The smart organizers sat motionless on the belt. Dalia's smile didn't falter. She was a professional after all, but I saw the tightness in her jaw. The technical failure was traced back to a documentation error in the system's core logic, the very logic she had claimed to have authored herself. It was a public embarrassment, a small fissure in the image of her competence. The following week, the atmosphere in the facility shifted again. I was summoned to the administrator's office. Miller looked tired. Beside him sat a man in a sharp, dark suit, a legal representative for Harsenholm. "Mr. Solen," the lawyer said, his voice dripping with a practiced, condescending warmth. "We've noticed a significant amount of activity coming from your accounts lately. A lot of inquiries, a lot of records requests that seem designed to harass my client." "I'm a private citizen exercising my right to a civil appeal," I said, sitting down and folding my hands. "If the records are accurate, my inquiries shouldn't be an issue." "Your inquiries are causing administrative friction for a multi-million-dollar corporation," the lawyer replied, his tone sharpening. "My client is prepared to offer you a settlement, an early release, a modest stipend, and a non-disclosure agreement. You could walk out of here next month, Grant. You could start over." It was a desperate move. Dalia was feeling the pressure. She wanted me silenced before the IPO. She wanted to buy my complicity with the very freedom she had stolen from me. "I'm not interested in a settlement," I said. "I'm interested in the integrity of the record. And as for starting over, I think I'd prefer to finish what was started first." The lawyer's face hardened. "You're making a mistake. You have nothing. You're a man in a box." "A box is just a room with a very high level of focus," I replied. "Tell Dalia I hope she enjoyed the launch event. I heard the sorting matrix had some issues." The lawyer left without another word. Miller looked at me for a long time after the door closed. You're playing a dangerous game, Solen. People like that don't just go away. Neither do I, Miller. That's the problem with a well-built system. Once it's in motion, it's very hard to stop. Over the next few months, the erosion of Dalia's reputation accelerated. The technical errors at the launch had prompted a deeper look by her payment processors. They began to review her accounts, flagging the same discrepancies Elias had found. Partners who had been eager to sign on for the IPO began to quietly withdraw their letters of intent. Dalia put on a brave face, posting updates about restructuring and focusing on core values. But the data told a different story. Her brand was bleeding credibility. I was no longer just waiting, I was preparing. I spent my hours in the facility gym, not to build bulk, but to ensure my movements were as sharp and precise as my thoughts. I practiced a cold, controlled stillness. I wanted to be a vacuum when I finally stood in front of her, a space where her charm and her lies would find no purchase. I had scheduled my final civil filing to coincide with the date of her largest business reveal, the opening of her global fulfillment center. It was the centerpiece of her empire, a physical manifestation of everything she had taken from me. I knew that by the time that date arrived, the legal system would have no choice but to acknowledge the metadata. The evidence was too clean, too absolute to be ignored any longer. The rehook arrived in the form of a visitor I didn't refuse. It wasn't Dalia, it was Clara, her sister. She looked hollow, her eyes darting around the visiting room as if she expected to be intercepted. When she saw me, she didn't speak for a long time. She just pressed her hand against the glass. "Grant," she whispered, "I saw the logs. Elias. He showed me things. I didn't know. I thought you were the one who—" "I know what you thought, Clara. You were part of the narrative." "She's panicking," Clara said, her voice trembling. "She's selling off the property in the valley. She's trying to move the money offshore. She says you're trying to ruin her, but Grant, she's the one who's destroying everything. She even used my name on the secondary accounts." "I know," I said. "I have the signatures. I have the timestamps. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to let the system finish its cycle, Clara. I'm going to walk out of here, and I'm going to go to the warehouse. I'm going to see the grand opening. She'll have security. She'll have the media." "Good," I said. "I want them all to see the final audit." The cliffhanger came as Clara was led away. She turned back to look at me, her expression one of profound realization. "She didn't just frame you because she needed the money, Grant. She did it because she was afraid of you. She knew you were the only one who could see exactly what she was." I watched her go, then turned back to my cell. The date of my release had been finalized. The court had reviewed the certified metadata Elias had provided and had issued an emergency vacatur of my sentence. The truth hadn't been a miracle. It had been an inevitability. I began to pack my few belongings, the notebooks, the colored pencils, the thousands of pages of logs. I didn't feel joy. I felt the grim satisfaction of a technician who has successfully debugged a terminal error. Dalia was at her fulfillment center, preparing for her crowning moment, thinking she had successfully masked her panic. She didn't know that the release order had already been signed. She didn't know that the man who understood her systems better than she did was finally coming to inspect the inventory. The final weeks of my confinement were defined by a strange, surgical quiet. In the world of logistics, there is a concept called dwell time, the period a resource spends idling in one spot before it is moved to its next destination. I had been dwelling for over 700 days, and the pressure building within that stillness was now a physical force. Dalia's empire was fraying at the edges, the loose threads of her narrative beginning to unravel as the payment processors intensified their scrutiny. The metadata Elias had leaked to the right compliance officers was doing its work, a slow-acting poison in the veins of her corporate credit. She was masking it well with aggressive social media campaigns and exclusive previews of her new fulfillment center, but the data showed the truth. Her partners were quietly pulling out, their risk management algorithms flagging the Harson name as a liability. I watched her through the small screen in the library. She was being interviewed in front of the new facility, a massive, glass-fronted monolith in the valley. She looked thinner, her smile a fraction too wide, her eyes darting toward the perimeter as if she expected a ghost to materialize. She spoke of innovation and legacy, but her voice had a brittle edge. She was panicking, but she was a performer to the last, desperately trying to keep the audience focused on the bright lights while the stagehands were abandoning the rafters. She had no idea that I wasn't just watching, I was coordinating. My release was no longer a theory. The vacatur had been processed, and the paperwork was moving through the bureaucratic machinery with the slow, grinding inevitability of a tectonic plate. I refused to let the legal victory be the end of the story. If I walked out now and faded into the background, Dalia would eventually find a way to reinvent herself. She would find a new victim, a new narrative, a new way to exploit the gaps in the system. To truly neutralize a threat like Dalia, you have to destroy the infrastructure that supports it. You have to make the brand toxic. I spent my final days in the facility refining the schedule. I didn't want to confront her at home or in a court of law. I wanted to confront her in the heart of her own creation. I coordinated with Elias to ensure that the civil filings, the ones that would link her personal hardware to the systematic looting of her sister's accounts, would be served publicly, on camera, during the ribbon-cutting ceremony. It was a sequence of events timed to the second. A logistics masterpiece designed to ensure that the moment of her greatest triumph would become the moment of her absolute exposure. The day before my release, Miller came to my cell for the last time. He didn't bring the usual clipboards or inventory sheets. He just stood in the doorway, looking at the empty walls where my maps of data had once hung. I had destroyed them all, shredded them into confetti, and flushed them away. I didn't need the physical copies anymore. The entire architecture of her betrayal was etched into my mind, a permanent directory of every lie she had ever told. "The transport is scheduled for Ohrid," Miller said. "There's a small crowd outside, mostly news crews. The story of the innocent logistician is starting to trend. I imagine your wife isn't too happy about the change in the script." "She'll manage," I said, my voice as neutral as the gray walls. "She's very good at adapting to new stories. She just hasn't realized that this one doesn't have a protagonist anymore. It only has an auditor." "You have a plan, Solen. I can see it in the way you breathe. Just try not to end up back here. Most people don't get a second chance to look at the logs." "I'm not looking for a second chance, Miller. I'm looking for a final tally." The morning of my release was bright and shockingly cold. When the gates finally cycled open and the heavy metallic thud echoed through the yard, I didn't run. I walked with a measured, rhythmic gait, my eyes fixed on the horizon. The media was there, a cluster of microphones and cameras, but I ignored them. They were part of the narrative world, the world of noise and sensation. I was moving into the world of action. I had a temporary residence arranged by Elias, a small functional apartment near the industrial district. But I didn't go there to rest. I had work to do. I spent the first 6 hours of my freedom in a nondescript office, meeting with the forensic team and the civil attorneys who had finally seen the light. We finalized the service of process. We verified the metadata one last time. Everything was in alignment. The system was green. Then, I did something that wasn't in the legal plan. I drove to the valley. The Harsenholm Global Fulfillment Center was a monument to vanity. It was a sleek silver building surrounded by acres of asphalt and high-security fencing. It was designed to look like the future of commerce, but to me, it looked like a vulnerability. I parked my rented vehicle across the street and sat there for an hour, watching the movement of the fleet. Dalia was using a proprietary fleet management system that she claimed was her own invention. I recognized the code immediately. It was a modified version of a system I had written for a different firm years ago, a system with a specific, undocumented bypass for emergency maintenance. I waited until the shift change, the moment when the perimeter security was at its most distracted. I didn't need to break in. I had the override codes from the original firmware, codes that Dalia, in her arrogance, had never bothered to change because she didn't believe anyone was smart enough to recognize them. I entered the side gate and walked through the staging area, my presence masked by the general chaos of the pre-opening preparations. I stood in the center of the loading bay, the air smelling of new rubber and ozone. This was her crown jewel. This was the asset she had built with the stolen remnants of our lives. I didn't feel rage. I felt a cold, professional disdain. It was a poorly optimized facility, built for show rather than efficiency. I moved toward the main signage, a massive backlit H that stood 20 feet tall near the entrance. It was the symbol of her brand, her name, her control. I found the electrical junction box behind the staging equipment. I didn't destroy it. I simply rerouted the diagnostic loop. I set the internal timer to trigger a systematic shutdown of the facility's lighting and automated gates at exactly 10 a.m. the following morning, the precise moment she was scheduled to take the stage for the ribbon cutting. As I was leaving, I saw one of her personal vehicles parked in the executive lot, a sleek white sedan that she used in all her promotional videos. It was a symbol of her status, a visual cue for her followers that she had made it. I walked over to it, the moonlight reflecting off the polished surface. I didn't scratch the paint. I didn't break the glass. I simply reached into the wheel well and pulled the sensor leads for the electronic parking brake, disabling the primary engagement mechanism. It wouldn't cause a crash, but it would ensure the vehicle was immobile, a heavy, expensive paperweight that would refuse to move when she tried to make her inevitable escape from the cameras. I felt a sense of profound, quiet satisfaction as I walked back to my car. This was action scene number 2. a silent, symbolic erosion of her physical environment. I wasn't just taking her to court. I was dismantling the world she had built, piece by piece, starting with the machines she thought she controlled. The rehook occurred as I returned to my apartment. My phone buzzed with a notification from Elias. He had been monitoring Dalia's private communications through the legal discovery portal we had opened. "She's moving," Elias told me over the secure line. "She just authorized a massive transfer of liquid assets to a shell company in the Caymans. She's prepping for a total exit. She knows the IPO is over, and she's trying to take the cash and run before the civil suit hits the wires." "She won't make it," I said. "The injunction is already filed. The moment she tries to authorize that transfer, the payment processors will freeze every account associated with her hardware signature. She's walking into a trap of her own making." "She's scheduled the release of her final statement for tomorrow morning," Elias added. "She's going to blame the technical failures on sabotage by her former associates. She's trying to play the victim one last time." "Let her," I said. "It'll make the ending that much more definitive." I didn't sleep much that night. I didn't need to. I spent the hours preparing my suit, a simple, dark charcoal ensemble that looked like something a high-level auditor would wear. I was no longer Grant Solen, the man who had been framed. I was the personification of the audit. I was the corrective measure. The cliffhanger came at dawn. I received a direct message on an old private account I hadn't used in years, an account Dalia thought I had forgotten. It was a single sentence, devoid of context or greeting. "I know you're out, Grant. I know what you're doing. You think you can break a brand like this? I am the brand. Without me, there is nothing to audit." I looked at the screen, a small, cold smile touching my lips. She was still trying to talk her way out of the data. She still believed that her personality was more powerful than the facts. She didn't realize that in a world of logistics, a brand is just a label on a box. And if the box is empty, the label doesn't matter. I didn't reply. I just checked the time. The grand opening was 4 hours away. The system was primed. The dwell time was over. I was moving to the final destination. The morning of the grand opening was a study in artificial perfection. The sky over the valley was a hard, brilliant blue, mirrored by the polished glass of the Harson Home Global Fulfillment Center. A fleet of white trucks was lined up with mathematical precision in the loading bays, their sides emblazoned with Dalia's minimalist logo. A stage had been erected in front of the main entrance, draped in heavy linen and surrounded by towering floral arrangements that smelled of cloying jasmine and expensive marketing budgets. It was a scene designed for a press release, a carefully curated moment of triumph intended to drown out the growing whispers of financial instability. I stood at the edge of the crowd, invisible in my charcoal suit, watching the machinery of her public persona go into overdrive. I wasn't here to hide, I was here to witness the collapse. The media presence was substantial. News vans with satellite dishes were humming in the parking lot, and influencers with stabilized cameras were weaving through the invited guests, broadcasting authentic excitement to their followers. I checked my watch. 9:45 a.m. In 15 minutes, the system would reach its first critical junction. Elias had confirmed that the civil suit had been officially entered into the court's digital docket 20 minutes ago. The metadata evidence, the logs that linked Dalia's personal hardware to the systematic looting of her sister's accounts, was now a matter of public record. The trap wasn't just set, it was already closing. Dalia emerged from the facility at 9:55 a.m. She was dressed in an ivory power suit, her hair pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. From a distance, she looked invincible. But as I moved closer, sliding through the throng of reporters, I could see the minute fractures. There was a slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted the microphone, and her gaze kept flickering toward her phone, which was likely vibrating with alerts from her banks and payment processors. She knew the freeze was coming. She just didn't know it was already here. She took the stage at exactly 10 a.m. The applause was polite, driven more by the presence of the cameras than by genuine enthusiasm. She began her speech, her voice projected through the massive PA system I had recalibrated the night before. "This facility represents more than just a warehouse," she told the crowd, her face projected onto the giant LED screens flanking the stage. "It represents the resilience of the human spirit. It represents the truth that no matter what obstacles are placed in your path, a clear vision and an honest heart will always prevail." The irony was so thick it was almost tangible. At that exact moment, the diagnostic loop I had set triggered. The backlit H on the building flickered once, twice, and then went dark. A low mechanical groan echoed from the loading bays as the automated gates, deprived of their primary logic signals, began to cycle closed, locking the pristine fleet of trucks behind a wall of reinforced steel. The stage lights dimmed, leaving Dalia in the harsh, natural glare of the morning sun. The crowd shifted uneasily. The influencers stopped filming. Dalia paused, her smile faltering for the briefest of seconds before she recovered. "It seems our state-of-the-art systems are having a bit of stage fright," she joked, her voice slightly hollow. I chose that moment to step forward. I walked toward the front of the stage, the space clearing before me as people noticed the stillness of my expression. I wasn't shouting. I didn't have a sign. I just had a physical folder in my hand, the hard copy of the metadata audit. Dalia saw me. The recognition was instantaneous. The red liquid didn't drain from her face. She was too well trained for that. But her eyes turned into hard, flat stones. She stopped speaking mid-sentence. The silence that followed was heavy, amplified by the sudden lack of background machinery. "Grant," she said, her voice barely a whisper into the microphone that was still live. I didn't answer. I reached the base of the stage and looked up at her. "The audit is complete, Dalia," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the quiet air. "The records are synchronized. The logs from the 3:14 a.m. log in at the guest house, they're in here. The hardware signature from your Ojai retreat, it's in here. The transfers from Clara's trust, every single one is linked to your device." A reporter from a major financial news network pushed closer, his camera operator focusing on the folder in my hand. "Is this the metadata evidence from the Solen appeal?" he asked, his voice sharp with professional curiosity. "It's the truth," I said, handing him a summary sheet. "It's a line-by-line reconciliation of the lies that built this building. You'll find that the payment processors have already begun the clawback process. As of 5 minutes ago, Harson Home is no longer a solvent entity." Dalia stepped back from the podium, her mask finally shattering. "You think you can just show up here and undo years of work with a few lines of code? This is my legacy." "It's a corrupted database, Dalia," I said, my voice calm and clinical. "And I'm the system administrator, I'm just deleting the errors." The scene erupted into a controlled chaos. The reporters swarmed the stage, shouting questions. The security personnel, sensing the shift in the power dynamic, hesitated, unsure whether to protect her or distance themselves from the looming legal disaster. Dalia tried to push her way toward the back of the stage, toward the executive exit where her white sedan was waiting. I followed her, not running, just maintaining a steady, inevitable pace. We reached the parking lot as the first of the process servers arrived, their black vehicles pulling up to the curb with clinical efficiency. Dalia reached her car and fumbled with her keys, her movements frantic. She climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door, ignoring the cameras pressing against the glass. She started the engine. The car roared to life, but when she tried to engage the drive gear, the system malfunctioned. The parking brake, which I had compromised the night before, remained locked in a state of electronic stasis. The car groaned, the tires spinning fruitlessly against the asphalt, but it wouldn't move an inch. She was trapped in her own symbol of status, a captured bird in a gilded cage. I walked up to the driver's side window and tapped on the glass. She looked at me, her face contorted with a mixture of terror and a pure, concentrated hatred. "You'll go back," she hissed, her voice muffled by the reinforced window. "I'll make sure you go back." "The logs don't lie, Dalia," I said, "and the world is finally reading them. There is no version of this story where you win. You're not the martyr anymore. You're just a clerical error in the process of being corrected." I turned away from the car, leaving her to face the cameras and the legal teams that were closing in from all sides. The twist, the one I had foreshadowed in my notes to Elias, was already beginning to surface in the media reports. It wasn't just about the money she had stolen from me. It was about the fact that she had framed me to cover the collapse of her business 2 years ago, a collapse she had caused herself through gross mismanagement and vanity. Her sister, Clara, wasn't just a victim of her theft. She had been a deliberate collateral damage, a secondary shield to keep the investigators away from Dalia's own core accounts. As I walked away from the fulfillment center, the backlit H remained dark, a hollow shell of a brand that had been liquidated in real time. The crowds were no longer cheering, they were recording the fall. The influencers were already pivoting, crafting new, authentic content about the shocking exposure of the woman they had admired an hour ago. I reached my car and sat inside, the silence of the cabin a welcome relief. I looked at the building one last time. It was no longer a monument. It was just an asset in transition. But there was one final move left to make, one final asset that remained untouched, a physical manifestation of her control that the legal system couldn't reach quickly enough. Elias called my phone. "It's done," he said. "The accounts are frozen. The board of directors has just issued a statement disavowing her. The IPO is officially canceled. You're a free man, Grant, in every sense of the word." "Not yet," I said. "There's still one more entry to reconcile." "What do you mean?" "The data is clean, Elias. Now I need to clear the floor." I ended the call and looked at the time. The sun was high now, casting long, sharp shadows across the valley. The media circus was still in full swing at the entrance, but the back of the facility was deserted, the automated systems still locked in their reboot cycle. I drove toward the secondary warehouse, the old staging ground where she had first started her lifestyle empire. It was a smaller, more personal building, filled with the physical inventory of her vanity. It was the place where she had sat at 3:14 a.m. and authored my ruin. It was the only thing she had left that hadn't been seized by the courts yet. The cliffhanger remained. As I pulled up to the gate of the old warehouse, I saw the lights were on inside. Someone was there, and I knew exactly who it was. The final confrontation wouldn't be in front of a camera or a judge. It would be in the place where the first lie was told. The old warehouse was located in an industrial cul-de-sac where the city's ambition had stalled a decade ago. It was a corrugated metal structure, weathered by the salt air and the desert wind, a stark contrast to the glass and steel monolith I had left behind in the valley. This was the origin point. This was where Harsenholm had been a mere concept, and where Dalia had first learned that she could manipulate the physical flow of goods as easily as she manipulated the people around her. As I pulled into the gravel lot, the single overhead light above the loading dock hummed with a low, irritable frequency. Her white sedan was not there. She was likely still surrounded by the media at the fulfillment center, but a smaller, dark vehicle sat idling near the office entrance. I stepped out of my car, the gravel crunching under my shoes with a sound like grinding teeth. I didn't rush. I had spent 2 years mastering the art of the slow approach. I walked toward the side door, the one I knew had a faulty magnetic strike plate. I had installed it myself 5 years ago, a temporary fix that had become permanent. I pressed my weight against the frame in a specific spot, and the lock clicked open with a weary sigh. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of cedarwood candles and high-end floor wax, the signature scents of her brand. Rows of shelving stretched into the shadows, packed with the curated inventory of her early success. Hand-woven linens, artisanal ceramics, and expensive wooden furniture. It was a museum of her vanity. At the far end of the floor, the office light was a sharp, yellow rectangle against the gloom. I walked toward it, my footsteps muffled by the industrial carpeting. When I reached the door, I saw her. It wasn't Dalia. It was her lead logistics coordinator, a man named Marcus, who had been one of the primary witnesses against me. He was frantically shoving hard drives and ledgers into a reinforced briefcase. He looked up when I entered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray under the LED light. "Grant," he stammered, his hands frozen over a stack of manifest logs. "You shouldn't be here. The police, they're on their way to the main site." "The police are busy with the public spectacle, Marcus," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm here for the private record, the one you're currently trying to remove from the system." "I was just doing what I was told," he said, his voice rising in pitch. "She said the accounts were ours. She said you were the one who authorized the redirects. And you believed her because the alternative was losing your salary. I understand the calculation, Marcus. It's a common error in judgment. But the audit has moved past the stage of excuses." I walked over to the desk and placed my hand on the primary server tower. It was warm, the cooling fans whirring at maximum capacity as it attempted to process a massive data wipe. "You're running a deep scrub script," I noted, my voice devoid of heat. "It's a good attempt, but you forgot that this hardware has a hardware-level mirroring protocol. Every bit you delete here is being backed up to a secure partition I created before I was ever removed from this building." Marcus backed away from the desk, his hands raised as if to ward off a physical blow. "I didn't want any of this. She promised it would be clean. She said you'd never look back." "She was wrong," I said. "I've spent 730 days doing nothing but looking back. I've looked at every packet, every timestamp, and every lie. You can leave now, Marcus. The data is already ours. Taking the drives won't change the tally." He didn't wait for a second invitation. He grabbed his jacket and bolted past me, his footsteps echoing through the hollow warehouse until the heavy exterior door slammed shut. I was alone in the heart of the lie. I sat down in the chair, Dalia's chair, and looked at the monitors. The progress bar for the data wipe was at 98%. I didn't stop it. I let it finish, watching as the screens went black, one by one. It didn't matter. Elias had the mirrored files. The wipe was just a symbolic gesture, a final act of futility by a failing regime. I stood up and walked back out onto the warehouse floor. I felt a strange, detached clarity. This building was the last physical anchor of the Harsen brand. It was the place where the narrative was maintained, where the authentic products were boxed and shipped to a world that believed in the image Dalia had crafted. It was the foundation of her control. I moved toward the main shelving unit in the center of the floor. It was a massive, industrial-grade rack, held together by a series of tension bolts. I knew the structural load-bearing capacity of this specific model. I knew that if the center of gravity was shifted by just 3 inches, the entire row would lose its integrity. I found the primary support strut near the loading bay. I didn't use a tool, I simply engaged the manual release for the pallet jack that was tucked under the lowest shelf. I pumped the handle, slowly raising the weight of 3 tons of artisanal furniture. I could hear the metal beginning to groan, the bolts screaming under the sudden, uneven distribution of mass. I moved to the next rack and did the same, creating a cascading tension throughout the center of the floor. The warehouse began to speak. It was a language of stress and failure. The sharp, metallic pops of rivets snapping, the slow, tectonic grind of steel against steel. I walked back toward the exit, my pace steady and rhythmic. I didn't look back as the first shelf began to tilt. The sound of the collapse was a thunderous, rolling roar. It wasn't the sound of destruction, it was the sound of a reconciliation. Hundreds of crates of lifestyle inventory were crushed as the racks folded in on themselves, a domino effect of industrial failure. The hand-woven linens were buried under shattered ceramics. The expensive wooden tables were splintered by the weight of their own branding. The air was filled with a thick cloud of dust and the scent of pulverized cedar. I stood in the doorway, watching as the dust settled over the ruin. The warehouse was no longer a staging ground for a lie. It was a heap of scrap metal and broken promises. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I sent a single text to Elias. Inventory cleared. I stepped outside and pulled the heavy door shut for the final time. The gravel lot was silent again. In the distance, I could hear the faint sirens of the city, the sound of the world finally catching up to the truth. Dalia would be found. She would be processed. She would enter the system that she had tried to subvert, and she would find that it was far less forgiving than she had imagined. She would spend years attempting to rewrite this ending, but the data was locked. The logs were certified. I walked to my car and started the engine. I didn't feel a need for reflection. I didn't feel the weight of what had been lost. I felt the lightness of a man who has finally optimized a broken process. My career would be rebuilt, not on the back of a narrative, but on the strength of the facts. I was a warehouse systems manager. I was an architect of flow, and I had finally cleared the bottleneck. I drove out of the cul-de-sac, the headlights of my car cutting a clean, white path through the darkness. Behind me, the warehouse was a dark, silent silhouette. The H on the sign had long since burned out. There were no more stories to tell. There was only the record. I reached the main road and merged into the flow of traffic. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I focused on the road ahead, the rhythmic pulsing of the streetlights providing a steady, mechanical beat for the journey. The system was back online. The audit was closed. I pulled over at a rest stop overlooking the valley. In the distance, I could see the lights of the Global Fulfillment Center, still surrounded by the flashing red and blue of the authorities. It looked small from here. It looked like a toy. I took the hard copy of the metadata audit from the passenger seat, the one I had held in front of the cameras. I didn't need it anymore. I walked over to the industrial shredder near the entrance of the rest stop and fed the pages into the machine. The paper vanished into 1,000 tiny ribbons, unreadable and irrelevant. The truth wasn't in the paper, it was in the world I had reclaimed. I returned to my car and sat for a moment, my hands resting flat on the steering wheel. The silence was finally empty. The weight was gone. I put the car in gear and drove toward the city, disappearing into the grid of lights and logic. The final decisive act was complete.